Valentinus, who was born around the turn of the century, so around 100, died by 80, maybe before then. We don't have a lot of information. He may have been from Alexandria, probably, but he flourished in Rome. And that's where he did most of his damage, was in Rome. Valentinus plainly had access to Christian teaching, understood Christian teaching, and sought to create a form of Gnosticism that would be specifically attractive to Christians. He dropped the unusual, strange-sounding terminology that we gave last time in regards to the names of the eons, and didn't really even get rid of the numbers of the eons. He just renamed them with biblical names. And so he seeks to create, so instead of the Barbelo, you'll have a biblical term of truth or something along those lines, light and the word and things like this that will be utilized rather than strange vocabulary, because it's clear that what he was trying to do was to develop followers from amongst Christians, like Paul warned in Acts chapter 20. Okay, exactly like Paul warned in Acts chapter 20. That's why I was saying what I was said about the prophetic material before. And so, as I said, they would send their people in to fellowships. They would participate. They would claim fidelity to what was being taught. And then they would start taking people aside. And they would say, well, that was a great sermon, wasn't it? Yeah, that was wonderful. But, you know, I've been meeting with this group, and we've been doing some in-depth studies, and, you know, we go a little bit deeper on this. Would you be interested in learning a little bit more, you know, and come to our meeting? And the exact same mechanism that the cults continue to use to this day really find their first utilization in the Christian era in Valentinus. He is just the prototypical cult-leading heretic, and he's brilliant. Arius was smart. Valentinus was smart. Falsehood is rarely produced by stupid people. They are very often people who have a very high view of their own intellect, and Valentinus had a very high view of his own intellect. The Valentinians viewed themselves as the enlightened ones, the ones who have received that gnosis. And in fact, in Valentinian theology, they are the spiritual ones. The rest of those Christians are the soulish ones. And then people who don't follow Jesus at all, they're fleshly. And so their idea is to grow the ranks of the spiritual by drawing from the soulish, by imparting to them this gnosis, this knowledge that will raise them up. But in the process, what you discover, of course, is that this knowledge is a fundamental denial of the foundational beliefs of the Christian faith. So what did Valentinians believe? Well, there are a lot of scholars who believe, and there seems to be fairly good reason to believe this. Yeah, there are some interesting things that you can find in the Gospel of Philip, and specifically the Gospel of Truth. Let me see. I don't know why how do they have this? The Gospel of Truth. You can find it in Marvin Meyer's. He did the editing on the Nag Hammadi scriptures. So the Gospel of Truth would be what you'd want to look up. There are scholars who believe that the Gospel of Truth is from Valentinus. And there's at least one Christian source that specifically says the Valentinians had something called the Gospel of Truth. So there's good reason to believe that. So there would be other scriptures that you would be introduced to at a later point in time. But again, it was so plainly, when you look at what Valentinus does, let's remember the Gnostic myth, the Father of Light, the eternal being, the perfect being, however you want to describe him, begins to have these emanations. Well, what Valentinus does is he uses Christian terminology about the Father, the Son, the Spirit, and it could actually be understood in some ways that it's a form of modalism, that he identifies that one primeval pure being as Father, Son, and Spirit, that these are different aspects of one substance of some type of thing. But he does not have the idea of actual persons who interact with one another, that one can become incarnate, truly take on flesh, that kind of thing. That wouldn't really fit. Those things are all spiritualized in light of the important thing, and that is where does creation come from? Where does the physical creation come from within Valentinian Gnosticism? He specifically recognizes that turning Yahweh into Yaltabaoth is not going to work if you're going to want to specifically infiltrate the church and corrupt the church from the inside. That ain't going to work. So there is a major de-emphasis on anti-Mosaic, anti-Old Testament stuff that you would find in standard classical Sethian Gnosticism. So the God of the Old Testament isn't an ignorant, evil rapist. But that still doesn't explain where creation came from, because here's the important thing to realize. In Valentinian Gnosticism, the one true God, however you describe him, is still not the creator of all things. There is no divine decree. There is no basis for duped. There is none of that is even there. There's no foundation for it. And instead, what you get is you get the Father and the Son, not as separate and distinct persons and homoousios or any of that kind of stuff. That's not a part of what's being even debated about at that particular point in time. Then you get the eons, you get the emanations that are named after biblical, really characteristics of God, attributes type things. But guess what the last emanation is? I'm really tempted right now to give a quiz to Rich to see how closely he's listening. But he'll say he's busy watching YouTube stuff right now, and because that's his job. That's what he'll say. But the lowest eon. So guess what the lowest eon, the last eon in Valentinian Gnosticism is? That's right. Sophia, wisdom. I've just been reminded that Satan disguises himself as an angel of light from the other side of the window. I'll let him explain that on Twitter later on today, which I'm sure he'll want to do, actually. Anyway, so the final eon is Sophia. So you're going, okay, are we going to get Yaldabaoth? And no. And you don't have quite as much, it's still there. You don't have quite as much of the emphasis on the male-female stuff. At least it doesn't seem to be. Remember, we have the descriptions of the enemies of Valentinianism, and we have a few fragments from Nag Hammadi. It's not necessarily sufficient to allow you to answer every question you'd like to have answered about a particular perspective. But anyway, what happens is something does happen with Sophia. But the result is not a disfigured deity of some kind. Instead, what you get, and it's interesting, if you look up Valentinian Gnosticism on Google, there's actually an interesting graphic under the name of Valentinian Gnosticism that is somewhat useful at this point, because it shows Sophia, and it shows Sophia in two, oh, no wonder. It's 2 degrees warmer than normal, and the fan's not on. That explains all of that. There we go. Sorry about that. It was getting just a bit toasty in here. We just fixed all that with ye old cell phone. Sophia is shown in 2 different realms. She's shown in the divine realm, and then there's a part of Sophia that extends down outside of that realm. When Sophia does whatever it is she does, it is described as ignorance. As ignorance. And as a result of this, she leaves the divine realm, and this ignorance, I know this sounds weird, it's the only way I can explain, coalesces almost into a cloud of ignorance that creates the physical realm. So the physical realm is created out of ignorance of the truth and the true God. And so anything that exists within that realm exists in ignorance. And some of the sources say that there was a co-laborer called error. And in the process, Yahweh comes into existence, but Yahweh is not evil, is not a racist. Rapist, racist. Not going to go there on political terms right now, but he is a lower deity. So in a sense, what Valentinus could say, sometimes just called Valens instead of the Latinized version, but what he could say, or what his followers could say in a Christian church, was, oh, certainly we worship the one God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But then you get into the meetings, and you get introduced to the teachings, and you get the gnosis revealed to you, and you discover that there is a God above who did not himself create Yahweh, but it was through his divine power, through Sophia, that Yahweh comes into existence. And Yahweh then creates the physical realm, but it's in this fog of ignorance. So what is salvation then? It's interesting. Again, I mentioned to you last time that I've been listening to this way leftist professor who's very good on the facts. I'm glad that I learned as a young person to listen to liberals and appreciate their ability to get the facts right, and then recognize where they just go right off the edge of the cliff. You can just tell this guy loves Valentinus. He detests Irenaeus. Just thinks Valentinus was, I bet you he has a Valentinus tattoo someplace or something like that, because Valentinus was just awesome. And he's just so insightful and everything else. The reality is that Valentinus developed a system specifically to draw disciples away after himself. That's what he was doing. And so remember, what they're trying to do is they're given his audience, instead of the ideas that you have in Sethian Gnosticism about getting the energy of the pleroma, or of the upper realm, out and back to it. Instead, what you have in Valentinian Gnosticism is this idea that you've got a part of the truth. We're going to give you the rest of the truth, and that truth will set you free. And salvation becomes learning this knowledge that you are much greater than you think you are, which has always been a great religious. I mean, that's what mankind's religions are always about. Is it's not that there's a holy God that you owe anything to or you violated his law or anything. No. That's far too prosaic. Instead, Valentinus presents this idea that salvation is coming to know God, and by knowing him, you're in essence absorbed back into him in sort of a metaphysical type of spiritual concept. And so, now all the Gnostics had this, and Valentinus had to be very careful here. But I'm not sure if I mentioned this yesterday, but the Gnostics had the idea that the garden scene and the fall completely misunderstood. The Gnostics said it was because Yalda by oath via Moses deceived everybody. Valentinus had to spiritualize that. But the idea is in both that the fall was a good thing and that it was Jesus or the Christ spirit or the Son spirit that, not Satan, that was seeking to free mankind by partaking of the fruit. In one of I'm not sure if it's in there, but in one of Valentinus's poems, and it might have been the Gospel of Truth, but I'm not 100% certain. It is said that he was put on a cross to become the fruit of knowledge, the fruit of familiarity with God. And so Jesus doesn't die to forgive sins. Jesus gives himself, and probably only in a spiritual sense, so that we can have knowledge of God. And therefore it was he, the Christ spirit, who in the garden wanted mankind to partake of the fruit so that you could know who you really were. You would have the tree of knowledge. That's gnosis. You need to have that knowledge. So the whole idea was, and I can't tell you how Valentinus would answer the obvious question that would immediately come up. If you were a Christian, you had been, you had, with pure motives, come to this meeting. You've been interested for a while. It sounds interesting. And now all of a sudden they drop this bombshell on you that what you've been taught all along about the fall and about the role of Satan was wrong and far too simplistic. And that, in fact, partaking of the knowledge, the tree of knowledge was a good thing, and that this was what the Christ Spirit wanted. You would think that, sort of the first question that would be asked by a Christian would be, but wait a minute, then how do you then deal with the entire narrative of the Bible that is written in light of what happens in Genesis 1. I don't know how he responded. There would probably be some very, very well thought out, spiritualized way of getting around the plain meaning of the text. And given that Valentinianism didn't start, it started before Origen, but it continues to flourish after Origen. Origen's influence would have only damaged the ability of the church to fight against that because of his allegorical interpretation, which moves the church, not everybody in the church, but many people in the church, away from a grammatical, historical interpretation of the text of Scripture. But the Christ Spirit then is involved in that partaking of the fruit. And salvation then is this taking in of knowledge of God and this personal relationship. And you could say it's through Jesus, but it's not through the historical Jesus in a mechanism of providing forgiveness of sins and imputed righteousness or anything like that. It is a Christ Spirit enlightening you as to your true nature. Now, if you're thinking, that means that same Spirit has been active for a long, long time. If you're familiar with any of the theosophy or Christian Science and all the rest of this stuff, they've all drunk deeply at the well the same kinds of things. And so even when there were enough Valentinians to form their own fellowships, they would look very, very much like the Christian church. They would have baptism. But when they would do baptism, it would have a different significance. The taking off of the robe, the old life, sin, washing, new robe. Instead, this is taking off ignorance. And salvation is a Gnostic. It's a obtaining of gnosis. And I couldn't help as I was reading this stuff. It's been, oh man, how long? It's the late 90s here in the Phoenix area. He's still active. There was a guy he's still amongst Reformed people, who took his church off into this strange stuff about how mankind never sins purposefully, but only in ignorance. And that the central emphasis of biblical revelation is the knowledge of God. The knowledge of Yahweh will fill the earth, and therefore that's really what brings about the end, is the filling of the earth with the knowledge of Yahweh. And so the whole idea that you never sin purposefully, it's not an act of will, it's an act of ignorance. You just don't know better. I couldn't help but while studying Valentinian Gnosticism going, oh, wow, that's a rather intriguing connection, because it really does totally change the whole concept of the forensic nature of justification, the forensic nature of the law court scene that we have in Romans chapter 8, and the mediator, and all of those things. It really removes the sin aspect and turns it into you just don't know. And that's why the Valentinians had debates amongst themselves as to, if you die as a soulish person rather than a spiritual person, so as a regular Christian that hasn't obtained the gnosis, what will happen to you? And there were some who felt those people were lost, and then there were others who actually had some type of a concept where the God of this world, Yahweh, who is not the supreme God, that possibly they might live in that being's presence after the final dissolution of all physical things, because physical things actually don't have any real being. Only those things in the pleroma, in the fullness, have true being. And so at the end, and this is the same in Sethian Gnosticism, it's the same in Valentinian Gnosticism, and it's the same in a sense in Manichaeism. In your eschatology, eventually the physical realm is done away with. There is no physical realm. And so clearly the idea of resurrection, as Christians understand it, and the new heavens and the new earth. A lot of Christians have, let's be honest, a lot of Christians have the idea that the new heavens and the new earth, it's pretty much just a spiritual thing too. Right? I mean, a lot of people think that way. Man, that's good. Apple cider vinegar, man, with club soda. I have not touched a soda, diet or otherwise, since February, and I highly recommend it to all. It will really help you out a lot. Definitely wakes you up. It's good stuff. Anyway, sorry, this is a live program. So, what is important? Let's make immediate application because time's running out. We're only going to go an hour today. Sorry, just the way it is. But in regards to the idea of there being a meaningfully consistent connection between Gnosticism, and now we see all the different kinds of Gnosticism, Manichaeism, Stoicism, the community at Qumran, Neoplatonism, that then is communicated via Augustine's alleged adoption of his former Manichaean perspectives. Then the miraculous transmission without alteration or development from Augustine directly into the mind of John Calvin, and from him directly into each one of our minds today, 500 years later. The whole Duped concept is plainly unsustainable on any logical or rational basis. The reason being that which is definitional of Reformed theology in regards to the decree of God cannot exist in any of those systems. There is no deity of sufficient personality, power, activity, sovereignty in any of these systems to have a divine decree that determines the very fabric of time. The forms of determinism found in those systems all differ from one another, and they differ on a level that categorically makes Duped utterly unsustainable and to be rejected by anyone upon any close examination and consideration of the actual issue. That's the first thing to point out. Secondly, that time period, I mean, think when Valentinus is born, as the last disciple's dying. John may have just passed away, and Valentinus is born. And that was a truly tremendous period of time as far as challenge for the church. Really, really was. It has surprised me more and more as I've been dealing with this, how rarely we give consideration to God's goodness in having protected divine truth during that time. But then when you think about 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, you think about I think it's 2nd John. Is it 2nd John? What is that reference? Yes, there it is. 2nd John 2. Let me just read the first two verses. The elder of the chosen lady and her children whom I love in truth, and not only I, but also all who know the truth, for the sake of the truth which abides in us and will be with us, eis ton iona, forever. The truth will abide amongst us, plural, in us, and will be with us forever. This is the promise of the apostle in 2nd John verse 2. This is written right before what seems to be one of the greatest challenges that the church has ever faced. And it just strikes me that there's much that we could learn from that. And one of the things that I have learned from that is to be thankful for God's faithfulness to preceding generations. In our modern day, we look down upon those who came before us. We diminish their accomplishments, their faithfulness. We have so much more than they had. And yet, they fought one of the greatest battles in the history of the church with weapons significantly less well-armed than what we have, but had the same spirit. That's the important thing. Had the same spirit. We can have all the knowledge in the world, but without spirit, it's not going to accomplish anything. So my appreciation for men like Irenaeus has grown tremendously as I have considered just the devilishness, the deceptiveness of Valentinian Gnosticism and the systems that sought to draw disciples away after themselves. It's exactly what it was. That's exactly what happened. And what a battle it was. What a battle it was. And it wasn't won by some silver-tongued orator. The other side, Arius was a great singer. He wrote songs. Valentinus was a great orator. And they still have their followers today, but not the followers of the truth by any stretch of the imagination. So that's always something to keep in mind. God used plain old people committed to the truth, steadfast, and they prevailed. They did prevail.